Good morning, friends. It is 10 o'clock-ish in Redmond, so time for .NET API review. Today's exciting language for me is English. Uh, we have a whole lot of red, so let's jump in. Need to make this bigger. All right. So provide bster marshaller for library import source generator 69021. We talked about this with an email, and it's a string marshaller. It looks just like the UTF-8 string marshaller, except this says bster, and the type's already defined elsewhere. It looks exactly the same. It's in the right namespace, and we have all the stuff. Does anyone have any objections?
Those were the shortest nuptials ever. I love it.
I just have one question. I'm happy with it. But is the string in the name duplicative, or do we just always choose to use string marshaller for anything that's about marshalling strings?
Yeah, so I mean the thing I gave an email is it seems like we have the marshalling kind, LPW stir, and then that turns into UTF-16 string marshaller, and so it seems to me that string marshaller is just the suffix of these types.
Yeah, the current pattern is it's just a suffix.
Okay.
Yeah, the way that I choose to interpret this is that the string marshaller means that it's coming from a managed string object, and the bster means it's going to an unmanaged bster.
So is this never used with a char star or a char array?
It's only used with strings.
Okay. So it's marshalling between a bster and a system.string, and hence the name.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool. All right. Add back obsoleted in OS platform attribute for .NET 7 68557. Does anybody know how to talk about this?
Yeah, so we have removed the OS obsolete attribute because it was kind of very similar to unsupported one, and there were no clear definition how we gonna use it or set it up. And we just removed it and use only having supported and unsupported attributes since enough at that time, but they are requesting to add the obsolete attribute back because first there is no message, and they want to have message so that they can say which API they can use, and also the API is not completely unsupported. In this case, not completely unsupported, but it's just deprecated and still working case. And also they proposing we might just add the message to the unsupported attribute and reuse it for obsoleted and unsupported. I think Emo would have more opinion on this.
I saw Emo.
Sorry, trouble unmuting my mic. Yeah, basically, we had this API before. We decided that it's not needed for .NET 6, so we removed it again. And now with the addition of the additional platforms that the Xamarin team wants to add, without this attribute, basically, they can't truthfully represent what Apple has in their SDK. And the trouble really is that they have a bit of a weird nomenclature on the Apple side, in the sense that it doesn't really blend with ours. They have this notion of obsolete, which is basically our version of unsupported. and then they have this notion of deprecated, which is our notion of obsolete. So it's slightly inverted. But basically, in order for us to project basically the notion of an API truthfully not being there, an API there, but you shouldn't really use it, and an API being there and it's fully supported. And so basically obsoleted in OS platform is basically a version of our obsolete attribute, right? In order to really say, yep, we have one SDK for all of iOS, but starting with version X, this API is deprecated, and starting with version X+2, the API is unsupported. That's basically it. And the only thing that this also adds is the message attribute to unsupported, because as I said, they have this notion of, the API is kind of there, so you can run it locally, but if you submit it to the App Store, it failed. And we basically project that as unsupported with message. So basically, it's similar to obsolete in the sense that you really shouldn't use it, but if you run it locally, it will work, but you can't actually submit an app with that. So we decided that we just project this as unsupported and just tell people, like in the message, oh, please use this other API over there. That's pretty much it.
So one thing that's a little curious to me is, so say that I want to mark an API as having been obsoleted in iOS 15 as the example here. So I would attribute my method with obsoleted in OS platform iOS 15.0, which would flow down to the base OS platform attribute type. So the base OS platform attribute type would say platform equals iOS 15.0. Like, does that seem strange? If all we're looking at is an instance of the base type, and the base type says, oh, this OS platform is iOS 15.0, or am I misinterpreting what that means?
So the intent of this base attribute was, it's just our lame way to group these attributes, right? So if you go, so it's an abstract attribute you can't actually apply. So the idea is if you go to the docs page and you look at OS platform attribute, you will basically see the derived types, and it basically shows you here's all the attributes that we have for annotating OS platform information, right? And that includes supported, unsupported, and now also obsoleted in. So yeah, if you just look at the base attribute, it doesn't tell you anything. You have to know what derived type it is.
Okay, got it. So the base attribute tells you, like, there's something interesting about iOS 15 here, but you need to actually look at the derived type to know what the interesting fact is.
Yeah, so the intent really isn't for people to, like, say, get attributes of type OS platform attribute. I mean, people could, but I think that's generally weird. It's mostly for docs.
Okay, got it.
So, what is this gonna do? Like,
what do you mean?
So all the ones we have right now are, if it says, supported OS iOS, so this is an iOS only API. We have the analyzer that says if you're on iOS, then don't warn that you're calling something that's bad. So now you're in iOS and it's expecting, like, it's obsoleted, so you get a warning and now you just turn off all warnings. Like, what's the user story behind adding the obsoleted?
I can explain that.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The issue is that, say, an API was obsoleted in iOS 15, and for one, Apple often tells us, say, use this API instead. Right now we can't. So that's the reason for the message property. Also, if the user wants to target iOS 14 with this app, he could say, hey, if I'm on iOS 15, use this new API, and otherwise use this old API, which is deprecated or obsolete. But we don't want to give the user a warning in that case, because it's already in his code handled the case where a code path that will never be on iOS 15. That's another reason for the new attribute.
Right, but so this will be, you had some code that said if I'm iOS, then I can go call this code, and now you get the next version of the library that is decorated with this, and now you get a build warning that says, by the way, newer versions, this still works, but you shouldn't be calling it anymore, because that's my understanding of Apple's obsolete.
Yes, correct.
And okay.
The way we implemented it for .NET 6 is that we have an obsolete attribute on this API, which will always give a warning. There's no way for the user to fix that warning, except for ignore all warnings. There's no way for him to say, hey, I'm on iOS 15, use this new API, and if older iOS, then use this old API, because the old API will always show the obsolete warning.
Yeah, I mean, like another way to think about it, it almost has the same behavior as unsupported, except you get a different message and you get a different diagnostic ID.
Different diagnostic ID? What for what?
Unsupported versus obsolete.
I mean, diagnostic ID.
What the ID will be?
You mean it will be the the warning level will be different, or?
No, I think it will be a warning similar to unsupported, but unsupported is not an error today. My point is that if you actually compile your code, the user experience is different in the sense that you get a different message and you get a different diagnostic ID, right? So the user can suppress effectively obsoleted things independently from unsupported, right? And I mean, you could argue that maybe our analyzer we just add a diagnostic ID property to unsupported, but that would be really weird, because if you look at the API on the docs page, for example, it makes sense to me that they have different attributes because they are fundamentally different things, right? So if somebody browses the iOS SDK on our docs page, it makes sense that they see unsupported and obsoleted differently. And when they look at this, it makes sense to them because that's the way Apple annotates the APIs, right?
Okay.
But for those customers, though, presumably they could just pragma warning suppress around the individual call sites, correct? Rather than doing it app-wide.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the general practice will be for almost all the OS platform attributes, we don't really expect them to suppress it. We expect them to write code like,
fix it.
Platform dot blah, then do this, otherwise do this other thing, right?
And that makes sense.
Different diagnostic because it's a different problem, right? If you call an unsupported API, that's very different from you're calling an API that's there, but Apple encourages you to move to something else, right?
Right. I guess the thing that I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, like, we have diagnostic IDs for the things that we obsolete, but we also have scenarios where people might have sprinkled all throughout their code bases calls to APIs that we're obsoleting. Is that the case here, or do we expect that when people call deprecated functionality in iOS, say, that they're doing it from a very small handful of places within their app? If they're targeting deprecated functionality.
Yeah, that one I can't quite answer. I mean, Wolf might be better, but my understanding in general is like, it is different in the sense that, we obsolete APIs in the framework, but it's more like you really shouldn't be using this anymore, but nothing bad happens because we don't remove them. Apple is pretty hardcore. They basically start obsoleting stuff or deprecating it, and then they're physically yanking it out, right? So like, it's basically I don't think you will accrue a lot of depth if you target iOS, because that 6 months down the road, you may have to physically delete those call sites because the SDK no longer has those APIs, right? So that I think is that's why I think like the idea really is like, if you target iOS, usually it's a sliding window because Apple forces you to keep current, and then eventually you have to do something about them, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess we would expect this to be more for your being like a thin shim, like you're really close to a p invoke basically, and that higher level components like HTTP client, if it sees that it's now calling an obsoleted OS platform thing, that it does the workaround and it doesn't reflect this going forward, except for the times that Apple does complicated, we got rid of this behavior entirely things. So like from our high level libraries, this should never show up, or almost never show up is my question.
That is correct, yes.
All right. Yeah, I looked just for consistency to see what we were doing with obsolete with message, because I know we added the diagnostic ID as part of the, in addition to being unique for suppression reasons, we wanted to be able to make sure that we had places that we could localize the content, and so, but we do have a literal message that is, because the BCL is in English. Do we think that? I assume we're just going to lift the message from Apple's headers in these, assuming iOS being the primary reason for this. We would just lift the message in English, and non-English is what URL is for.
Yeah, Apple doesn't provide anything except English. Simple things we copy, we can replace it, but yeah, it's basically coming from Apple's headers, the message.
Okay, so Emo, you don't think that this wants the URL format type thing that we did for obsolete?
No, because our obsolete basically has, the idea is you can provide a custom diagnostic ID, right? In our case, I mean, if Apple adds that ability and gives them different error codes, maybe. But I mean, and I think the idea would be we just project them as, we have one diagnostic ID for an API was obsoleted in a particular OS platform, and that you can provide a different URL. I would think that maybe every time we basically support a new version of iOS, maybe we auto-generate a docs page that say here's all the APIs Apple has deprecated in this release, and then everything that is basically coming with this attribute might have that URL. And then we might do something interesting and write some details if we really feel like it. But I think given the size of iOS, I expect this to be mostly mechanical, and so since they don't have a diagnostic ID that's custom, it doesn't seem necessary. But we could add it. I mean, the problem is if we add it later and we name this URL, that might be unfortunate. But I have a hard time believing that Apple would do that. So it seems unlikely.
No, I agree. No, a URL format's probably not needed here.
I mean, the one question I have is, like, Jeremy, you asked whether this is basically visible in our high-level libraries. I mean, I could imagine a case where we do the same thing we do with the OS platform attributes in general, where we just forward this to our customers, right? If we say we have a, if you look at the what is it? Forgot what the name now is, but there's this Xamarin thing that basically just does this, general high-level API for GPS and other things. Maybe there is some concept that Apple just yanked out entirely, and we just don't have a way to support it anymore at all. And maybe we do the same thing. We just put obsoleted in OS platform on our stuff to give our customers a heads up that this is going away, and then it's our own attribution, and we control the message and the URL ourselves, because at that point it's a manual application, right?
Right. I was assuming more like, there was the iOS, like 10.8 era HTTP/networking library, and then they had the new one in like 10.11. Don't quote me on these numbers. And they wanted people to start moving toward it, and that it would be something like our version of HTTP client. We would then see, we have this obsolescence. Like, there's an obsolescence upcoming. We should change the guts of our thing, and not say, by the way, HTTP client might stop working at some point. Like, so for high level things, we would hide it. But yeah, like the GPS sensors, if it's, well, we built this exactly looking like their API, and the way they redesigned it, it's not even translatable. So sorry, this goes away now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to me, the goal is what you described. We would generally, especially in the BCL, right, we provide generic things that, should always work. And if Apple decides to revamp the networking stack, well, that's unfortunate for us, but then we would have to do work. But I could imagine, even an HTTP client, right, there's a ton of features in, all the things. And I could imagine there's some specialized property that we added for some iOS thing that now goes away, right? But I generally don't expect like, all of networking now disappears or something like that. At that point, we would use a different mechanism to convey that, more along the lines of the other spec that I have out right now, the capability-based approach that we want to do for browser, because it would be very unwieldy if we were to use versioned OS platforms for concepts like that. But yeah, I mean, the general shape of these attributes was designed such that library authors can forward to their clients if they wanted to, right? There's nothing fundamentally stopping somebody from doing that. And I mean, it doesn't really make sense for obsolete necessarily, but it clearly makes sense for things like, you know, I only work on Windows, or I only work on Linux, or I only work on this version of Windows and higher.
Okay. So the only thing I have left is looking at supported OS platform. It also supports enum, field, and interface in addition to what's proposed here for obsoleted. Should they be the same, or is there a reason it's different?
That's a good question. I just copied what we had in the spec, and we may have added these other things after the spec was finalized. So I don't have I mean, in general, I would say yes, we should probably have support for enums, because we have certainly done this for enums before.
Is there any reason we shouldn't just say .all?
Yeah, some things don't make sense, right? There's like delegates, and what was the other
there's
thing
like
that is usually in the
generic type argument.
yeah, there's some things. I mean, all is almost always the wrong
like,
answer.
If you put it on a delegate, like, what's the worst that can happen?
You get upset
It's
that the
mostly
analyzer
because-
didn't look for it.
Yeah, that's one thing, right? We need to actually look at. We actually have to honor this attribute, right? And we generally don't want to put it on things that we don't check. But then, you know, there's also debatable, right? Would we ever put it on a func? Probably not, right? Because why would we? That would clearly always work.
I mean, you
Apple-
could, if you have a delegate type that's specific to a particular platform, because it's the only thing that ever needs that signature, like the delegate's a useless type now.
Yeah, my concern is just customers may use it, right? And then there's nothing really wrong with doing that, right? It's just it's generally questionable as something like if a delegate really only ever supported on one platform. I mean, it's a bit like saying a type def only works on one platform, right?
I mean, a delegate is a type. Like, it's entirely possible that, you know, it's the shape of it simply doesn't make sense outside of any other platform.
Yeah, but
sure.
if you used the delegate type for your own purposes, it's not the delegate's broken. It's just the only place that we thought that you would have passed it no longer takes it. So that method is now obsolete. So you have no reason to use the delegate. But this is, again, like where I think it's weird that I understand the convenience why we let this get put on types, but, you know, we've seen things like MD5 is not supported on, I believe, iOS. And it's like, well, but why are we stopping someone from calling MD5 hash size? Like, that's a const. But the analyzer's like, no, you can't read that. So, to me, painting these things on types is bad because when you hit these corner cases like that, but I understand the convenience. So.
I mean, and I think Levi's point is valid. Is if we basically say interfaces are banned, then it kind of makes sense to ban delegates because that's really what an interface is as well. But no, with DIMs, you could argue, well, interfaces can actually carry code, so maybe we shouldn't. But delegates are definitely code-free, right? So it is a bit of a weirdness to say, because it's just a shape definition, right? And like anybody can use that to define their own helper functions, right? Which, if you actually write cross-platform code, you may want to do, right? And then your common thing just dispatches happens to go via this delegate. But yeah, there's really nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. But I think if we want to add it to delegate and other things later, that we should just do them all uniformly. I don't think we should increase the scope on this one.
But no, I think not. The more I think about it, like we have put it on enums mostly. I mean, on enums is kind of what you said, Jeremy. It doesn't really make sense. It's a const. But the reason we put it on enums is because we don't have good data flow analysis, right? So we say, we don't really want to say if you call this method with this particular combination of enums that's unsupported. So we just say screw it. We just mark the enum member itself as unsupported, and that works well enough. And maybe there are cases where the same happens to be true for the delegate eventually, right? But I think the point is we would have to change the analyzer to actually do that. And before we do that, it would be weird to mark it, because then we might corner ourselves later if we add support for it. Because now we flagged an existing code, right?
That's fair. All of that aside, nullability, message, URL.
Yeah, they should all be, I guess, yeah, you're right. The message property should probably be nullable. Or what we do with the other one. I think the other one we might have decided that we return an empty string, and it's now.
Well, obsolete attribute, I believe, has nullable message in URL. Yes,
Does it? Okay, then
it does. Yeah.
we should do the same thing here.
For unsupported OS platform attribute, it's a little strange to me that message is being made a settable property rather than a constructor overload with the get-only property. That seems to be counter to the other types that we've introduced here.
That is fair. We should probably add the overload. I buy that. See, there's always value in reviewing APIs.
What about naming deprecated instead obsolete?
Yeah, so the reason why I didn't do that is because I don't want to tie it too much to iOS, right? I still want to maintain some sort of, the notion that we have on our side is obsolete. That's how we call it. And it would be weird, in my opinion, to use deprecated for just the platform version alternative for that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's benefit to us being consistent with our use of the word obsolete within our types.
Yeah, my other concern is like what happens if, Android introduces a similar notion, but they call it, I don't know, depreciated or unrecommended or something, right? You can only be consistent with one thing, and then in that sense, I'd rather be consistent with ourselves. So that's the only consistency that we can actually maintain.
All right. Did I get all the question marks right?
Looks right to me. Well, if I assume we don't need a URL for unsupported, right? Because there isn't really anything for us to provide. Is that fair? Did he drop off?
Who was that question to?
Rolf, the guy that was earlier on the call.
Yeah, the URL, Apple doesn't really provide any URLs. So what would we have to, that would be something we would provide if we could provide more help for something that doesn't fit in a message, but we haven't had the need yet, so.
Fair enough.
Yeah, we could always make an FW link easy.
And it just goes to a generic page, which is you're welcome.
I mean, it could go to the docs page with code samples, and the docs page maybe has links to like the Apple breaking change doc. I don't know. Inherited false, is that expected?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's true for all the APIs that we have for OS platform, because, well, if we actually have an inheritance hierarchy, I would expect us to annotate the derived things separately, right? I would not expect them to just carry forward.
Sure, if that's our policy, that's our policy.
The constructor is different.
Sorry, could you say that again, Boya? You broke up a little bit.
The constructor names a bit different. Obsolete in versus obsolete in null.
I see.
Why
okay.
we obsolete always bottom just like same as other.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I think in general we have inherited faults for almost all the static annotations, I believe. I think that's also true for the ones in code analysis. Nullability, I believe.
Makes sense, otherwise it's harder on the analyzers. Alright. Anything else? So at least it sounded to me like we were going to not add URL to unsupported OS platform until we had a need for it.
Yes, that's.
So.
I mean, the only reason why we do it for obsoleted is mostly because we have it on obsolete already. So it seems something we may want to do, but.
All right. Add a rich type for reading X509 authority information access 68792. You can all take a nap now. So we've seen this come up, the concept of this come up before. So we have an X509 chain. We added the like download certificates equal false property, which means don't. If you can't figure out where the parent of a certificate is, don't. If you don't have it locally or as part of the chain, don't go ask the certificate, hey, do you know where your issuing CA comes from, and then go download it. So this is the extension that actually gives that information, and there are two things defined in the current version of the RFCs that live on this. One is the CA issuers values. The other is where you would get OCSP responses for this certificate. And the data is super complicated the way that it's included. Like, you can say that OCSP comes from email, but that's not useful to anything that would ever want this. So what I've proposed here is, we have the things that look like all the other extensions of, we have a default constructor and you can go build one from existing data, and we have is it a critical extension or not? The spec says this one should be false, so I defaulted it to false. And then if you're reading it, like for example the future OCSP server stapling for Linux feature, then what you probably want to do is just ask, what are the URIs that were listed for OCSP? Or if you want to go walk and find CA issuers manually, then what are the CA issuers URIs? So I made IEnumerables for these. The implementation, they're actually yield return, so it's just really IEnumerable. And then these are just special cases for this sort of other one of enumerate URIs of some kind. You're responsible to know what magic is. These two will use the values that the spec says that are associated with those names. And anything else that's more complicated, that's what ASN Reader's for. So this is a simplified view of, I think this one's like 3 pages in the RFC.
So I guess I'll bite then. The copy from method is the idea that you instantiate an empty extension and then you copy from ASN encoded data and it merges it in?
Yeah, yes.
Is it a reset or a merge, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
It's reset. So this is like, take it up with I just spaced his name, Lamakia. Yeah, this is Lamakia era .NET crypto. So the way that things work in .NET Framework, and I don't remember which way we did in Core, is like when you're looping through certificate extensions, it actually builds everything as X509 extension, and then it asks, was there a special type for this? And then it instantiates the new type and then calls copy from the old type. And all the copy froms are implemented as reset. So they flush their data and then just copy the .raw value out of ASN encoded data and then reinterpret it.
Okay.
The override only made it in here because I just copied what the refcs update looked like.
I guess the other questions I had then were, you have IEnumerable going in as a constructor and IEnumerable being returned from methods, but I assume that you make your own copy of the data after the constructor is called, correct? Like you clone the incoming list?
So following what we have on other extensions that aren't complicated, this constructor lets you build one. So you pass in some OCSP URIs and some CA issuers URIs. I think I put them in this order because this one's like .1 and this one's .2 in the OIT arcs. But you pass these things in, it goes through, it encodes the extension, and now the .raw data property is the correctly encoded version of this extension. So it's built at that point, and then these are just reinterpreting what it re-encoded. So there is no mutation visibility.
Okay. Next question, access method OID takes a string instead of an OID. Is that just because you expect people to have it already as a string and don't want them to have to create the OID structure around it?
Yeah, I mean, we can overload it. But yeah, what we've generally seen is the string is more useful than the OID type, and that most calls, if we had this only as OID, calls, if anyone called it, would say new OID of access method OID, and why are we wrapping it in a string to then pop it off and just read the value property? But we can certainly overload it if you think that's useful.
Sure. I guess the last question I had was, I think the base type gives you a way to get the raw data back, correct?
Yeah, so X509 extension is an ASN encoded data, and ASN encoded data has a raw data property.
Okay, got it. So if you need to know if the incoming raw data blob had things that weren't representable by this type, then you always have the ability to get back the raw data and then run it through the decoder yourself.
Yep.
And figure out what was in there. Okay. Yeah, because I know you and I talked about this the other day, being like, what happens if there's other stuff that we simply don't know how to represent through these properties?
Yeah, if you support doing directory lookups via the X500 distinguished name option of a CA issuer, then open ASN reader, throw it over the raw data property, and you get to extract it. But since I don't think Windows even supports that, I don't know why anyone would. And Windows and LDAP are the same thing.
That seems reasonable to me. I don't have any other feedback on this end.
Oh, I guess there is one thing. So the most of the extensions types do have an overload, or do have a constructor parameter that takes an ASN encoded data, I think. Basic. And I decided that was silly because all that we do is read the raw data property off of it, and so I flattened this into the byte array and span that we have on the base class. So that is one deviation from the base type that I introduced. They're from the current sibling types.
The constructor will still throw if the envelope isn't of the correct type, correct? Like if the envelope doesn't represent AIA information, if it represents something else instead?
Yeah, so these are going to call decode on the data, and they'll throw if they couldn't decode the structure.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is just it's just some syntactic difference, because what every other constructor does that takes an ASN encoded data is it ignores the OID associated with it and just reads the raw data. Like, it just checks for null, reads raw data, and calls that out. And I again looked at it as all we are doing is making people say new so we can pop a thing off. And if somebody has an ASN encoded data, they can just pass .raw data, and then they get it. So,
or a copy from, as you have.
Or they can use the copy from. Yeah, so use the default constructor and call copy from. That's the exact same thing as what the other guys do.
Okay. Neat. Neat is doing some heavy lifting in that sentence. See, one of the benefits of both running API review and bringing your own API to review is that you get to fast track it.
I mean,
also being one of like 5 people in the world who understands it.
I was gonna say you say fast track, but I think it's been ready for review for at least 2 weeks. It's only
hey, we have a 7-year-old issue coming up in a few weeks.
It's only blocking because this is blocking another feature we want in this release that didn't require API. All right.
So I assume Kevin is not very happy, or who is asking for this?
Me.
You're asking?
Like, I needed this for a non-API feature that we're trying to add for SSL stream, and I didn't want to copy all of the decode logic from where we have it in Linux chain building into SSL stream. It felt like a waste, and people have asked for this before.
People meaning Kevin.
No. I don't think
People's
Kevin's ever
doing
cared.
some heavy lifting too.
Random people.
I needed it, to be fair.
All right.
We have more than one person that is a people. Excellent.
Yeah.
There are dozens of us. Dozens.
Maybe dozen of us. Yeah, more people will want it later because they want to be a CA even though they shouldn't. But, all right, it's neither here nor there. Next up, add a property to zip archive entry to indicate if the entry is encrypted. 68897.
I can talk a little bit about this one. So there is an ask to just detect some zip entries if they're encrypted or not, just because right now the only option they have is to just get an exception at the time that you try to decompress them. So this is just like a upfront check to skip zip archive entries that are encrypted with any kind of encryption, because there are many of them. So there is another issue related to how to handle encryption, so encrypt and decrypt entries in the zip archive spec, but that's a topic maybe for another review. So at the bare minimum, this could at least solve the problem, or at least solve the ask of skipping those entries instead of throwing.
All right, so for anything that this is true, we currently throw when trying to read the data, yes?
Yes, but yes and no. So for there's two kind of encryptions. There's a strong and weak encryption, and strong is AES-128 and all of those. So we throw for those, but for weak ones, which is zip crypto, they are decrypted and like they're decompressed, like are garbled. I mean, so we don't throw, but we have like garbage. It's not readable, or it's not what you would expect to have. But yeah, it's still incorrect, I guess.
Okay.
Wait, so if it's using the old crypto spec, we just produce garbage data when we extract it?
If it's using this, if you get a zip archive that has an entry encrypted with the old crypto stuff, which is called zip crypto, it produces garbage data. Yeah, when you encrypt it.
Is the scenario there that we then expect somebody to go and manually decrypt it after the fact, or it's just garbage and sorry?
I guess it's just garbage and sorry, or maybe there are another tools or another APIs to take that data and pass it through a decryption. But
Well, I don't
I
I think the question is, are we giving them the ciphertext and they could decrypt it, or are we doing something weird like taking the ciphertext and running it through Deflate and seeing what happens?
I think we're taking the ciphertext and running it through Deflate. There is no logic to handle.
I'm surprised that even works, honestly.
Yeah, I was expecting an exception as well.
Fair enough. I wonder why bit 6 breaks it.
Because normally you don't compress encrypted data. Normally you encrypt after compression.
Right. I mean, it could be the case that zip crypto
before.
does it wrong.
After.
That they run a weak encryption and then compress it. And so maybe Deflate is actually giving them the ciphertext. I don't know. I haven't read the spec. But so this isn't just a precondition. It's because one of them doesn't throw, but it is useful to indicate that something weird is happening. So for strong encryption, is there anything they can do?
No, as well.
I mean, do you give them
there's-
access to the raw stream, like without running Deflate, or?
Again, I don't know. I'm not super familiar with the steps. Yeah, as you mentioned, I don't know if you need to. I don't know if encryption happens before deflating. All I know is that when you try to read the stream, we throw an exception. So we can give them the stream, but there is no. Yeah, that's going to throw.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess getting the bit is better than just depending on the throw or corrupted data, but it does seem like there's a scenario missing. which is maybe what.
Yeah. So
is the entry itself readable even if the contents aren't? Like, is the file name encrypted at least?
no, so there are different encryptions also in the zip archives. You can encrypt the entries, so that will be like in the local header, I think it's called, or you can choose to encrypt everything, which is also encrypting the names on the central directory. But in this case, we at least we first want to support decryption. Detecting encryption on local headers or the entry itself, not in the central directory or anything. So at the time you get prompted by for a password is when you try to open an entry, not when you try to open the archive.
So if there are like multiple options for encryption, like would it make sense to maybe make it enum, like encrypted entries, encrypted no encryption or something like that?
Yeah, there are multiple options. So one of the alternative proposals is to, instead of having bool is encrypted, is to have like encryption type, and then have like zip crypto AS128 and many things like that. I don't know which one is better, to be honest. Because I don't know what would you do with that information. I mean, do you write code to, like, depending on the encryption, you're gonna use a different key?
I see that you have an issue to add password support at some point in the future. It would make sense, I think, to add the enum in the future, but for now, a Boolean property should be fine. You can have the Boolean and the enum side by side, no problem.
Yeah. Yes, correct. And other thing that I wanted to point out is that there is an ask for this from my internal partner, but they want to use this on Net Standard. So that means that it's not going to be a new API for Net Standard. But one of the proposals here was to maybe add one entry in the exception dictionary. There is a dictionary in the exception type to add like data. I think it's called exception.data. Just to signal that things are encrypted. Is that okay? I mean, I guess that's not an API question, or maybe it is.
System text JSON does that to smuggle data through the exceptions that it throws.
Oh, okay. Cool.
We would just document the exceptions that we throw. Like, if you want to know if something happened, look at this particular field inside the data dictionary. But you said net standard though, right?
Yes.
Like, isn't zip archive entry like in full framework?
Yes, it is.
So they're not going to get the behavior smuggling that bit through the data dictionary, because we're not changing full framework to have this behavior.
Yeah, you're right.
So only a net standard 2 library running on net whatever, because I don't know if this is delivered as an Uber, if it's in inbox. Assuming it's inbox, only somebody running on net 7 while compiled for net standard 2.0 would see this.
Yeah, I would, at that point, I would just make them use reflection to get the property.
Okay.
Like, that's what reflection's for, light up behavior.
But okay, so there's not a good scenario story around this, but it both tells you A, what you get might be gibberish, and B, what you get might throw. So it's useful, just not a complete story. So I guess seems like a reasonable increment to me.
Yeah, it's a baby step toward getting to a better story.
So how do we, like, what would the API shape be of the full feature?
It's not fully fledged. I think Jeremy made a small kind of proposal.
Like right now, so depending on what actually comes back from the weak encryption mode on this, like theoretically, if the algorithm is for zipcrypt is you encrypt it and then you deflate it, then what we're giving back is now just the ciphertext. Somebody could write zipcrypt, decrypt themselves, and recover the data. But for the strong encryption, if we're throwing, then what they would need is access to the uninterpreted stream, and so we would need, open and like open raw. And then now if you call open raw, you could run that through AES, and then I don't know what the story is with that. If you presumably you deflate it first, but so you'd run that through AES decrypt, and then you'd run it through deflate stream yourself. But then, like, someone could build a story on top of it. As it is right now, they get here and it's like, well, okay, this was useless. Moving on.
I'm not sure I understand entirely what you're saying. So basically, you're saying if the archive entry itself is encrypted in an algorithm we don't support, then OpenRAW would help them if they were willing to write the decryption algorithm themselves, right? But I was more referring to the thing when the entire archive is encrypted, because then you can't even get the zip archive itself, right? So you can't even get to the entry and check is encrypted, right? Or can you?
My understanding is archives aren't encrypted. An encrypted archive just means every entry is encrypted.
I think my understanding is that there are variations of this spec that says that support archive encryption. And I need to double check.
Okay, because I've seen, like the Linux zip tool, like it can still print the header of things that were encrypted with like WinZip, and then it's like here are all the files that I see, but they're all encrypted. So like, good luck.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you can read the file name, you just have entry-level encryption, right? I think when David said like you can also encrypt the file names, I assume that meant the entire archive is encrypted and you can't even get to the entries without decryption. In which case, if you try to open the archive, you just blow up with, sorry, this is an invalid format we can't read. So at that point, you're just entirely screwed, I guess. That's why I was asking, like, what would be the API shape be of us supporting encryption at the archive level, because it seems we would have to do something that, sits at a higher level. It can't be at the entry level.
Yeah. I guess what I'm gonna say is that there could be split into two separate issues: supporting archive and supporting entries. In my opinion, it can be addressed. I guess it could be studied together, but it can be addressed separate. Does that answer kind of?
Sort of. So, like, I guess what I'm asking is, like, if we were to do both, would we end up with a different API as opposed to, or we just start with the entries and then we don't design the entire thing, and then later on when we design the entire thing, we are like, oh, we wish we would have done a different design. That's the only thing I want to avoid, even if we don't do the feature now.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Like, I mean, it's possible what you said is true, but I think we should at least think about what the archive level encryption would look like, and then if that might look the same, we might only do one of them, right, API wise, even if we only choose to support entry level only.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable.
My guess, honestly, would be that if an entire encrypted archive is a thing, that we're probably throwing before we get to a type that could even have expressed that. Like, we probably say new zip archive of a file, and it goes, I don't know how to read this.
So I
don't think it would change I don't think it would change the what we do for the individual encrypted entry. Like, we would still need this even in conjunction with something at the higher level, because you could still be mixed mode or whatever.
Yeah, I guess my mental model was, if we were to support it at the archive level, we would probably have to do something like, zip archive open or whatever the API is that gives you the archive. Would either take some encryption options or it would take some other constructor parameters, right? And then if you do both, then maybe that's also the place where you'd say what you want to do for entries rather than doing it at the entry level, right? And then just have it automatically flow, for example, right? So that's why I was saying, like, at least we should think about how we would do the whole archive thing and then see whether that does both. And it's possible that it doesn't, and we still end up with an entry-level API. That's fine. I don't have an objection to that. It would just be sad if we do it later and then like, oh, damn, wish you would have done it differently.
Okay. So are you saying that you think this should be needs work pending further investigation?
I mean, if David tells me right now, I thought about it. I don't think it is the same API. That's fine. I was just asking whether we have thought about it.
Yeah, I think we thought a little bit about that.
So as in, like, I thought about it and I think it's a bad idea, or I thought about it and I need to think about it a bit more before I can answer that.
No,
it's up to you. I'm not
Okay.
trying to be mean.
I don't know. I'm always afraid to own things like opinions, but it's I thought about it and I think it won't mess with the archive encryption.
Sounds good to me.
I think I hit copy, but I'll go hit it again.
I honestly think they added this button just for you and me, Jeremy. I'm pretty sure.
When you say missing user story, you mean like there's no scenario or
There's nothing. If it returns true, it tells the user you're screwed. Go use another tool. Like,
Right.
There's nothing the user can do using your class if this is true.
Okay.
Again, something like open raw to give a stream that doesn't run through deflate would be a thing they could do if this is true. It would maybe a whole lot of work, but they would be able to complete their scenario. Right now, if it's true, their answer is go find another library. That's what my comment is indicating.
Okay.
You haven't finished the feature, but you've indicated we're either about to throw or what you're going to get is gibberish. So, yeah.
Okay.
It's better than what we are. It's not a finished answer. As far as a user who wants to read one of these archives is concerned. All right. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks to you.
Client WebSocket upgrade response details 259er18. Is this Tomas?
I mean, I can speak to it. This is Natalia, and someone from the networking team would be best to represent it, but I can at least provide details if we want to proceed with it.
Sure. We'll see if we get to yes or need more data.
So the basic idea is with client WebSocket, wanting some people have asked for the ability to understand the response headers and the response error code, both for or the response HP code rather, both for success and for failure situations. Right now, you don't have access to any of that information other than if it fails, there's an exception that gets thrown. But this is all sort of a black box, inside of client WebSocket because it's establishing the connection. So there have been a couple suggestions for how we could accomplish this. I think the networking folks wanted an opinion from this body about which way to go. The first approach is add a new overload of connect async. There's an existing one, and pass to it an object that you would like for the implementation to populate either on success or failure with the status code and the header information. This makes it opt-in. It's just an overload of connect async. You construct your WebSocket connect result, pass it in, and the implementation can fill in the details that it gets. This also allows you to reuse that object if desired, so you could clear it yourself and then pass it back in. The second approach, if you were to scroll down to option 2, is to put all of these things as properties on client WebSocket itself. There are already some properties there that sort of represent, waving my hands a little bit, connection level information like sub-protocol, and then also there's some close information that gets populated there. The downside to that is that sort of makes it it's not pay for play if you only do that. So, because the implementation would then always have to basically store that information and expose it, which if there were a lot of headers might be storing onto a lot of data. So we could then add a property to the options that are used with client WebSocket to make it opt-in. So basically, if you wanted these details, you would set this collect HTTP response details to true, and then client WebSocket would populate this data on the client WebSocket, and then potentially also have a setter exposed that would then allow you, after you read out the data, to null it out so that you weren't holding on to it for the lifetime of the WebSocket. So these were the two approaches that they were considering.
Okay, so I can say the first one seems weird to me, that you pass in a result and
I mean, imagine
it's
it's named
populated.
something other than result. It's gathered data and put it in this thing, diagnostics, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I just
it
feels
that's going to be populated.
It feels more like it would be, connect and report status async, returning task of this result. Like,
But that doesn't work if it's exceptional.
Well, don't you expect the status code and response headers to be populated if it's exceptional? Like, why else would you need the HTTP status code?
That's my point. If it's exceptional, you're not going to get back you can't have task of T. You're not going to get the T.
Got it.
Unless you grab the task and yeah. So
I
guess
you also want the headers in some situations when it's successful. So you could put it on the exception object, but then you're only going to get it in exceptional cases, not success cases.
Yeah. So the status code is only useful in exceptional cases, and the headers are useful potentially all the time. Correct.
I don't think there's a scenario where status code is useful in success, because it should always be the same status code.
I'm like rewinding my brain 10 years to remember when we did this in full framework, how this all worked. Okay. I think I do like the second shape a little better, just because, again, I agree with Jeremy. It feels a bit weird to pass in an object to be populated rather than to have the WebSocket object itself contain that data.
Yeah, I mean, I can buy it with the when you want this, the time that you want this is the time that you couldn't get it as a return value. So that definitely makes sense to me. Of if we went the first route, why we would go that way.
Why not an out in the first route? Why not an out variable?
Because you can't out from
on an async method, it doesn't work.
Oh, got it.
Is it really that expensive to collect HTTP headers even if you don't want them? Like, is that a measurable profit?
Debatable. It would I think depend on how many headers you're talking about. The primary concern wasn't the throughput hit, but rather the prolonged memory overhead of you've got 1 million WebSockets open and you're carrying around extra state.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because these are long-lived, so we would assume that if there is an instantiation, like whatever.
Right.
But yeah, if they're long-lived, then that's clearly a problem. So
let's
say that someone goes to collect it. Like, do we expect them to null out the dictionary when they're done?
I think if I understand the usage correctly, it would basically be, by default, none of this is collected. If you want it, you opt in by setting the property to true, and if you care about the memory overhead, then after getting the data, you set it to false. Set it to null rather.
Okay.
So WebSockets involve multiple HTTP transmissions, right?
No.
Not really.
Okay. So there's not a, you've connected and it has some stuff in it, and then you've sent some data, and there may be different stuff in it that the sent
No,
data
you basically
is...
you make a request, you get a response, and that request response in headers includes basically the establishment of the WebSocket connection, which is basically just saying, hey, here's an ID. Yep, I like your ID. Let's talk. And then after that, you're just talking over this raw. You're sending, just raw data over this HTTP connection.
And in the existing sub protocol is a thing that got established during the connection.
Right. It's basically like, yeah, we're talking WebSockets, but I also want to speak RFC 117.94, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And it's an arbitrary thing that you agree on.
But okay, so yeah, I think I like the second one. I feel like the HTTP status code should just always get set like the sub protocol does, because it has no cost. It's an int. In fact, storing the nullable may be a waste. But the headers, my gut would be have it without the collect option, and if somebody feels that the collect option actually is significant, I guess you said it's not any individual request, it's the aggregate memory consumption. So yeah, I guess having it look opt-in like option 2 looks reasonable to me. But I think the HTTP status code should always be collected because it has no cost.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only question there is like, what would HTTP status code return before the request is even initiated?
0.
-1, 0. Okay.
I mean, if we're concerned about implementation, right, it doesn't actually have to store a nullable. It can store an int and just return null if it's not connected. So it's just an API. It's just an API question of do we want it to be nullable or not?
Fair enough. I guess having it be the nullable of I'm not connected yet, this makes no sense is reasonable.
I mean, I have no strong opinion. If we want to just have it return 0, like or -1, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly if it's always collected, and if it was delay collected, then it definitely makes sense. So for me, it was, well, if we say that it should always be collected, now we don't need the question mark of you should know, are you before or after connect? But
right. I mean, from that perspective, I get pretty annoyed sometimes when working with nullable value types, just because I have to always do the either dot value or is value, is int or whatever. So if we expect it's only going to ever be used, and we can just know people are only going to use it because it only makes sense after connect async, we could just have it be int, and if you access it before, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah. I generally prefer non-nullable with sentinel values like 0. Just like you said, it's a lot easier to reason about, at least to me. But yeah, I do like option 2 though, all of that said. Settable HTTP response headers, sure. People can set them to null if they want.
Sorry, I'm looking up a namespace. While I'm looking this up, there's a question from YouTube chat, which is a couple days out of date, but it's a current question of the scoped keyword that had come up for the span entrapment. If somebody can find a link to the spec where they're talking about that and post it in YouTube chat, that'd be great. I assumed it was on C# Lang, but couldn't immediately find it. Turns out scoped is used a lot in that repository. Seconds. Yeah, sorry, Chad. I was looking for a good break in the conversation.
I'm just curious, why is HTTP status code returning int and not the enum?
Don't know.
Okay, I'll leave that as a note.
I know it was discussed. I don't remember why it went one way or the other.
Okay.
I just posted the link in chat because I think nobody else can probably except .NET Foundation because they usually block URLs.
Fair enough. Thank you, Emo. I'll just go ahead and change it, and I can change it back. All right, happy?
Ish.
Done.
Done.
Really?
Didn't
All right.
we discuss this?
It says
We
ready
did. We
for
marked
me.
it as was the polymorphism thing. I suggest we skip this because we spent a lot of time on JSON already. Let's try to get maybe some of the other API proposals done because we have not worked the backlog in a while.
Okay. System runtime compiler services metadata update original name attribute 66222. I'm already confused.
Marked it ready for review.
Lambda Geek?
Oh, I
Alexa.
think that's Alexa on the runtime team. We should probably invite them because unless somebody here has context on that. I think it's related to hot reload would be my guess.
It is related to hot reload.
Okay, yeah, so the client WebSocket upgrade response details was the last one from the preset agenda, so that makes sense.
Jeremy, would you be able to speak to this, or do we need someone else?
I can speak to it a little bit just from the basic context, but I don't know if I'll be able to speak to it fully.
Yeah, then maybe let's just push it out for Tuesday and invite Alexei.
Yeah, okay.
That might be a better idea.
The command line one we
Understood.
also have to skip.
Should we place bets on whether we can get through all the reds today?
We will
Well,
not, because the command line stuff, I need to set up a dedicated meeting for that again. But we can definitely get to the JSON one, maybe.
All right. .NET console logging uses a blocking collection, which is not optimal for cloud-native applications. 65264.
Sure, I can talk to this. What we want to do is that for console logging, currently we use a blocking collection, and when there is a lot of logs to write to console, if there is a high load, the blocking collection queue has it would reach a limit that currently is very small, and that will cause a huge drop in the requests per second of logs to get logs to get written to console. So what we are proposing here to do is to allow the users to have configurable to be able to configure the buffer size, and also they would have the ability to, if they want, drop log messages the moments where the buffer is full, because the current default is that we don't allow dropping, we only wait. And so the default, so you would see in the proposal, there's two things that we're adding to the options. One is an enum called buffer console logger buffer full mode, and that is either wait or drop newest, and default would be wait, which is currently what we do today. And in the conversations in this issue, there were there were developers who said they would have interest in having the option that would drop messages when the buffer is full. So this will allow for that, and also basically the buffer size currently is we have a very small number. It's not actually the buffer size, it's a queue size, but it's, yeah, so I think the reason for having a buffer size is it makes it similar to, I think event pipe log also has something similar, so it's kind of along those lines. And Eric Earhart is also on the call. I think he would have, if there's anything I missed out.
No, I think that was it.
Yeah.
And per the description, it sounds like this is for production applications, correct? Because you're talking about having a high throughput rate and lots of concurrent requests.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
So my immediate feedback then, knowing that this is for production, is drop newest sounds like it would be indiscriminate, and drop informational, critical, warning, everything equally, correct?
Right.
Is that the behavior we want in a production app?
So the missing scenario here, at least from the people who are asking this, is that they're also logging to somewhere else, like a log, like some other log, and also the console. And so the console blocking today is what they don't want. So even when it hits the max buffer, even if they would set their max buffer, they don't want the console blocking threads, just waiting for the buffer to free up. And so since they're writing to an extra, a different log as well as the console, just dropping them from the console is the scenario.
Okay, so nothing's going to get lost then. The console, I guess, is if you're just hooking up like a live site monitor. Is that the scenario?
Something
One
like
more
that,
time.
yeah. But like, okay. It's a secondary, the console being the secondary logging place.
Got it.
I mean, that being said, what do we think about that kind of scenario of saying no, just log, like, because you have a log level, right? But then also putting the log level in the what to drop. Because like what happens if it is a bunch of errors, let's say, right? You're getting more than a meg errors, and now do you block because you said you're dropped to just dropping info and warnings?
I mean, another option, which will conflict with a later piece of feedback that I would have, is add a mode which is call a callback. It's I'm full. Here's the thing I can't put in the queue. Return true to block or false to drop it, and then that would let you say, "Oh crap, this is error. Yeah, wait on this one. We need to get that in the queue." They'd be like, this is informational. Just drop it. Because once policy's hard to describe in an enum, the answer is let someone write code to do it.
I guess another question I had is why drop newest rather than drop oldest?
Why drop newest as opposed to what?
Drop oldest. Like if you have some type of monitor hooked up, don't you want the most timely up-to-date information rather than the oldest information?
My idea was that the other ones are already in the queue to be processed. So since the queue is full, it's just like purely implementation thought is that they're already in the queue. So now we're going to add something we don't have space to add the other one. So we're just going to drop adding it anywhere. But
well, I guess what's the scenario behind somebody hooking one of these up if they already have, like you said, an actual logger that things are being without loss recorded to? Why do I want to hook this up in addition to another logger?
Why would you want to hook up the console logger in addition to other loggers?
Yeah, it was mentioned earlier that was a scenario, that console logger would never be activated by itself. It would be activated alongside another logger that would never drop data.
If it's in drop mode.
Well, there are different. So the idea is that there are different providers, different logger providers, and I think let's say if you're on Windows and you have what's the other loggers that are more widely used on Windows? Is it event
there's ETW?
log?
There's
ETW. Yeah. So in those cases, because they get other means to have the logs, console logger is just purely optional, and that's why they don't want to have a lag in their throughput or a sudden drop.
Right, but I believe ETW's queuing
why?
is drop oldest.
Yeah.
Oh.
I guess my question is great. Why have two loggers? Why, if they already had an ETW logger, why did they also hook up a console logger? If we can answer that question, I think the answer to the question of what should the default behavior be kind of falls out of that.
Right.
Well, the conversation is in this issue.
Can you summarize?
It's talking about I linked. So they're running in a container, right? And many out of the box container monitoring things look at standard out, right? And standard error.
Okay, great. So we're talking about monitoring. Is this monitoring for live site in order to observe issues that are occurring in the live site, or is this some other type of monitoring?
Or is it just a quick check to see if the process is still alive? Hey, look, it wrote something in the last 20 minutes. The process isn't dead.
I mean, I think you see what I'm getting at, right? If this is monitoring for the sake of I need to determine if my website is currently healthy, then that means that we should probably not be dropping warning and critical, for instance, maybe only dropping informational. But it really comes down to why does someone want to hook up this particular logger if there's another one already in effect?
because they want a stream of logs to go to the console.
Yes, but like, what are they doing with that information?
I mean, in my case, when I go to the live stream on Azure, I just want to know what the thing is doing right now. There was a warning like 2 days ago. I don't care.
Right. I imagine it's just log, and then when a human comes to see what's going on right now, if it's going to another place like a database, it's like you don't want to go look at the database, right? It's like you want to go to the portal and just be like, what's going on in this current service?
But I think like in that mode, I think drop all this makes the most sense, right? Because it's kind of like the normal circular buffer model, right? Where, you know, once you reach the end, you just start overriding from the beginning again. I think that seems like something.
Yeah,
and
that's kind of what I was getting at.
What to drop, or are we talking about dropping it all?
What to drop?
Agree
like dropping newest, not dropping oldest. I think.
Yeah,
so.
But everybody agrees that dropping at the log is okay.
Yeah, like it depends on why you're looking at the log, right? If I'm looking at the log in order to spawn some pager duty alert, like then it's absolutely forbidden for things like error and critical to be dropped from the log. Like if that's my scenario. If my scenario is I'm looking at the log just out of sheer morbid curiosity, then drop oldest is probably the appropriate default rather than drop newest. But that's why I'm maybe annoyingly harping at the question of why is someone actually looking at this?
Right. Well, the default, I believe, is don't drop. Yeah, default's to wait.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's once somebody's doing it, this is an option that they came in with. If we're only supporting one drop, then why are we picking only the one? If we add both, then it's whatever somebody felt like when they called it.
So one thing is the reason I didn't think the drop newest as opposed to drop oldest would be that much critically different is because as soon as the buffer size, as soon as you start writing some of them out and then the buffer is partially open again, the next log that is trying to get added to the buffer, it just gets immediately added. It's just like the moment in which as soon as the buffer size gets emptied just a little bit, the next log gets inserted in. So we're not necessarily gonna, and then this is only in the case where we are having a ton load of logs at this moment getting in. So it's not like we're gonna lose the latest one. It's not like we just suddenly stopped and then we will not be able to. So if you want to see if the application is still going and everything, it's just I don't know how to...
I mean, I think that they changed this in Win 10, but let's say you're have the Win 7 console model and you highlight some text in the console stops accepting updates when you do that. It pauses the ability to write to it. So if you end up with, you have a highlight on the console, then this would be, that's when you're going to start now hitting your blocking and your queuing. You leave that up for, I don't know, a weekend, and you come back and you're like, clear this and let it go. Now, if you were blocking, then your whole app died. But if you're on drop, when you hit enter, I would expect the 10 minutes most recent of data, not the 10 minutes of data that happened 3 days ago.
So effectively, the things that will get dropped are the logs that were being added when the queue was very in the traffic. It's not necessarily the latest ones that will get dropped. Maybe towards the end, there's not a lot of traffic, and then we'll get the newest ones.
Sure. And how quickly in practice, how quickly does the log actually tend to cycle through? Is it when things are dropped, does it tend to be cleared after a few milliseconds?
Currently, the logger doesn't drop anything, so this would be a new feature. But did I understand the question?
Well, let's say that we hit the limit, right, of 1 megabyte.
Okay.
How quickly does a realistic application tend to purge enough of the log entries for it to start accepting new data?
mean, it's as fast as it can write out to the console. Right?
Yeah.
It's just in a loop saying while there's something in this queue,
Mhm.
EQ it right to the console, start over.
So the entire queue drains in 20 milliseconds?
Actually, there are benchmarks. If you scroll up in the description, there is a gist that has some benchmarks in it. The console logger today is as fast as console write line, or a little bit faster, just because of I think it's because of the lock overhead. Yeah, so you'll see a bunch of benchmarks, but like the one in this table is not because it's on benchmark.net, it's not necessarily showing the fastest, but like you see like 503. I think the better one is the stopwatch that I did just after this code snippet. Here are some numbers. Speed. That's for system console, for logging console, yeah. For logging console.
Yeah, so unless the console is actually jammed, and your queue is actually talking about megabytes, or sorry, bytes, which we will come back to, the entire queue is a fifth of a second. So messages getting dropped, we're talking about a fifth of a second window.
Okay. So not too bad in practice then.
But yes, it could be that one of those messages that pops up in that fifth of a second is an error that you wanted, but once something's being dropped, right, unless you do a delegate of acceptance or a delegate for, hey, I'm full, let's go through everyone and make a decision, which will increase your enqueuing cost. You have the yep, somewhere you're going to drop something, it might have been an error that you cared about.
What's your behavior if a single message is bigger than 1 megabyte?
Currently, we don't go with the byte size, we go with like a queue length. So as you said, like if there was a single log message that had a string larger than that, then it would not have a problem. So this is, I think, a corner case that I think about.
Well, everything's a corner case until you start handling network input. And then you actually have to, put pen to paper.
Because if we're right, and so that for max buffer size in bytes, you said that right now the queue is determined by the number of entries. So what does this mean? And if it means if the heuristic sum of message is already bigger than this, of course you're talking now bytes, but you don't take bytes, you take text.
That's true.
So are you assuming 2 bytes per char?
Yeah.
Because if you're writing to a console on Linux, it is somewhere between 1 and 4.
But the buffer's not for console though, right? The buffer is for how much stuff in memory you're holding, waiting to write to the console.
That you take.
We take a string.
Yeah.
And so bytes, yes, would be string length times 2.
Right. But so I'm indicating here you should, because if you're writing on Unix, somewhere you're going to have to cycle that through UTF-8. So maybe if you're talking about the bytes stored, but then why don't you just talk about max buffer size in chars, because that's what you can actually measure. And then, are you counting the chars for the word error?
I think it would be either. It's either current proposal or it's your proposal divided by 2. Like it's the exact same thing. But it's just how do you want to talk about it?
No, because like the buffer you can end up in the middle of the character, right?
a string in memory has a length, and each of the things of the length is 2 bytes. Right?
Plus the object overhead and other thing. Like you're not talking bytes from like, you know, total items subtracted from a gen whatever heap. You're talking bytes of a subset of a segment, which is really the character size times 2. I'm just saying, if you're counting chars, you should count chars.
Yeah, and bytes and chars aren't necessarily a good metric for how long it will take to process something.
Another thing alternatively would have been, rather than to go with the buffer size, would be to have entry size max entries, but that max entries in buffer, which today is 1024, which is a very small number anyways, but it would ignore the fact that if the entry is just a single character or like a larger string. That way, like,
right, and you know, saying you have a queue length,
yeah.
that makes total sense to me, right? So max queue length.
That makes everything much easier. In fact, we don't need to keep track of the size.
Yeah, you're not adding, or you're not doing plus equal length on add and minus equal length on DQ. Like, you just ask the queue, how big is it?
Exactly.
Noah was pushing for byte length, right, Miriam? Do you know why?
Oh,
he was pushing for it?
I think even David was pushing for it. I think because I could be wrong, but event pipe, one of these other ones go with buffer size, but one thing we could, like I heard them say, is that we could go with the length and then like later on change it if we, you know, but like maybe I'll just ping in the chat, ping David in the chat right now and see.
I mean, I assume the concern with length is it doesn't really mean anything, right? You could
it doesn't.
You could have 1,001 megabyte strings, and you can have 1,000 3-byte strings or 4-byte strings. So if you're actually trying to, you know, limit your memory consumption to a certain amount, limiting the queue size isn't particularly meaningful, unless you always have logs that are approximately the same size, and you can base it on that.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, we could include all of this with a counter that, like when I was testing this out in this gist, if you scroll up or down, you'll see a screenshot where I was checking to see what the queue length is. And we can have a queue counter for the for whomever uses it, to see if they reached 1024, which is today's length max, or not. And then they can check. Maybe we can have a counter for buffer size, even though we expose the length, the queue length, but maybe we could have a counter that shows the buffer size, or both.
I mean, again, you have no idea what your buffer size is. You can't talk about this in terms of bytes. Like, you're storing a logging level, you're storing a whole bunch of things. If you're talking about it really in terms of bytes, it's either bytes of payload, and you weren't given bytes of payload, or you're talking length of text associated with the context. So I think if you want to talk about the text length, that's totally fine, but bytes don't make sense here.
It would be the combined length of all of the strings in bytes, but yeah, considering each character is 2 bytes, but yeah.
Well, I do still want to raise the flag, like you're using length as a surrogate for how long it's going to take in order to process, and that is not necessarily a strong correlation.
But if you're using something like
the length would be proportionate to how many times you call the, let's say, console, the console API.
Is it?
It shouldn't be, because I wrote in chat, like, if it sounds like from the benchmarks that you gave, writing to the console is the expensive part.
Yeah.
The chattiness is the expensive part. If while you're dequeuing, you can somehow aggregate data and write an entire chunk of data at once, that sounds like that
Exactly.
might give you a significant
A
perk
lot.
boost.
Right.
That is correct. That is correct.
Your numbers here say 1 and 100 are the same.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
is correct.
So, and that
And
somehow
in
1,000
fact,
kicks over to be 4 times as expensive. But
And in fact, a future improvement would be to be able to have like chunks of these, like buffered over, and write them all at once.
But presumably you're using
in
something like a
their
blocking
observation.
queue. And saying you want to build a blocking queue based on some secondary metric, that sounds like it's going to not be easy, because you're no longer asking it to do its own definition of block or drop. Like you're doing a weird, you're going to have like a, this is a very big race condition of drop add, and talking about it in terms of how much stuff you're enqueuing seems much harder than how many, like using a thing that the collection that you're using understands, which is, have I hit my max length? I mean, you could do it, it just seems unnecessarily complicated.
Remind me,
one is-
block. No, sorry, go ahead.
Which one? Which one is, you mean? Complicated?
So I assume your implementation, you're using something like a fixed-sized blocking queue that is an existing class that you can say your maximum queue length is 1024 or whatever.
That's what it is today, yes.
Right. So saying you want to talk about the maximum in terms of the contents is not a thing that the queue already understands how to do, meaning you're now inventing a new blocking collection, or you're surrogating the collection in terms of some other math you're doing, which is a race condition between the reader, who's trying to drain things out quickly, and all of the writers who are trying to add things in. So this seems like once you want to try talking about, here's the maximum I want buffered, well, you have the, what if the one message is too long, so what's the definition of full? You have, I can't ever accurately count how much is in it because of the non-atomic notion of counting the size. You're going to start adding a whole lot of incremental adds, or interlocked adds and decrements, which are going to be weird because you don't know if you got enqueued or not. Like, this sounds like a massive amount of complication for, I just want the limit to be 512 instead of 1024. Like,
That's quite accurate. Yeah.
so it feels
It
like
is a challenge.
massively over-engineering to talk about it in terms of the length of the content.
That said, if you're confident that wait and drop newest are the appropriate semantics that you want, I think the enum that you have is appropriate for that. From a behavioral perspective, like, I do question it, as we've discussed earlier, but from an API review perspective, like, it seems straightforward enough.
Yeah. Well, the question I have here is, it seems like blocking collections probably already have a notion of what to do when they're full. So would it make sense? Like, is that an enum we already have? And should we just be using
it? Which one is it? If it's an enum that we already have?
So, like, if we have a blocking queue, does it not already describe a block policy? And if it describes it in terms of an enum, why don't we use the same enum and then just let that be the value somebody passes in?
I don't know if there is any, but
Steve, you work with a lot of these weird things. Do you know of one?
Sorry, say it again.
Do we already have an enum that describes wait, drop newest, drop oldest, etc.?
We do, but it's specific to channels.
Okay.
It's like block channel full mode or full behavior or something, and it has, basically the same options here: wait, drop newest, drop oldest. There might be one other as well.
Oh yeah, I see it. Drop newest, drop oldest, drop right, and wait. I don't know what drop right means.
Feels like drop newest.
Drop right, WRITE.
Oh, drop right. Yeah, so it's distinguishing. So wait is this obvious. Drop oldest is the thing that's the beginning of the queue. Drop newest is the thing that's in the queue, but that was most recently put there. And drop right is the thing that I'm about to put into the queue. Get rid of that.
Yeah. So the add method no ops, or the in-queue method no ops, yeah. Okay.
Right.
Oh, and newest is overwrite the last slot.
Right.
Which is a different meaning, I think, than the one proposed here.
I pinged David in the chat, and I think what he's agreeing to is queue size would be fine as long as the default gets increased to a large number.
Okay, so we want to replace max buffer size and bytes to
max buffer
queue
length.
length.
Or queue length.
Yeah, I would also encourage you to consider whether you want some type of override policy to say things that are being written at a certain level or higher bypass the drop, and we just try to put them in the queue and we block if we have to.
So rather than having the enum, right?
Maybe this could be in addition to the enum, but when we were talking about scenarios earlier, one of the things that came up was monitoring to make sure that your application is actually in good health. And if that is a scenario for this, then messages directly related to your application's health absolutely can under no circumstance ever be dropped.
Okay.
I mean, that gets... I guess that means that the local call would then go into wait.
Also, like, you might want to consider, instead of this behavior, like maybe doing some kind of throttling or something. Like, because I assume the scenario is like you print something really quickly on the screen, you cannot read it anyway because it's too fast, and basically you might, I don't know, maybe you want to limit to like one message per X amount of time, maybe, or something.
I don't know. Like now we're just inventing a whole bunch of new features.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, that's generally a property of the logging sync itself, which would be the console itself, generally.
Is
And
the drop-in
for-
policy something we could add later if people requested it?
Console logger buffer full mode dot drop by policy means
I mean,
ask something
yeah,
else.
I'm just saying one of the scenarios that came up was that people would use this for app health monitoring. If I had a scenario where I needed app health monitoring, and this API documentation told me it could drop messages related directly to the thing that I care about, I personally would not have confidence using it for the scenario that I need it to be for. So I'm not saying you have to add it, but take that into account when you're designing this.
I also posed a question on the chat for having. I posted the screenshot of the counter. Do we need to decide the name of the metric and counter? The one that would show the queue length, the current queue length. You'll see it, the screenshot in the chat.
This is perf counters, right?
Yes, it's similar to the system runtime counters, like the ones that you see in the screenshot, like it would show up under.
I don't think it's needed for API review, at least.
Okay. Okay, so I can do that.
It's a good question, though.
So on the screen, there's mixed match of buffer and queue. Do we want to rectify that
still
at
have
all?
buffer?
Yeah, there's console
buffer
logger, buffer full mode.
So queue full mode.
Noah had a preference for buffer in the comment, in his last comment on the issue.
I mean, buffer makes sense if we're talking about bytes or.
Yeah. Okay. But not in this case. Okay.
And then. Okay.
I mean, I can hit Control Z.
I mean, what's wrong with buffer? I mean, you're still buffering, right? Like the concept of buffering applies whether it's text or bytes.
So if I said max buffer length, is that so? Would that be okay if it's still the number of enqueued messages?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Like,
yeah, I mean, yeah, that's fair. If you say just max buffer size, I would expect that to be number of bytes. It's true.
So channels calls it capacity, which.
But channels is like the problem is the loggers are doing foofy things, right? Like the loggers take a bunch of parameters and do some stuff, and the channel takes it's a channel of a kind of object, and you give it an object, and then somebody else takes the object. So it having a capacity it's always talking in terms of one kind of thing. So I mean, we could call it max capacity here, and you can describe it in docs, but it's given that there was a desire of limiting the theoretical cost of logging versus limiting the number of enqueued message items, etc. It feels like using just a bare length and not describing what you're actually lengthing is just setting up for a bunch of rabble.
No, yeah, I'm not saying just use capacity, but instead of max something length.
Oh, call it queue capacity?
Right.
By the way, is the logger is this enum specific to this logger? Wouldn't it be useful for other loggers as well? Like, I'm just curious if we should just drop the console logger apart from the name.
I mean, the fact that it has a queue at all is kind of an implementation detail, right? Like.
I mean, for the logger, it's maybe not. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, the naive implementation of a console logger is when somebody writes something to me, I'm just going to write it directly to the console, right? Done. But the problem you get into is multi-threaded, right? And so the implementation detail here is that the console logger like puts all of them on a single thread, and so that way they're all written sequentially, right?
Yeah.
Or at least there's no hashing of your console.
All the things this writes get serialized, yeah.
Right.
As in, done in a serial manner. Not as in, makes Levi cry.
So, for console, I think maybe Eric already mentioned, but the dropping the behavior, I don't think other loggers, aside from the console logger, which uses the queue need, the drop behavior. I don't see that immediately being needed for others, just other than console logger. But there's some conversation on the chat as well with Levi. Levi chatting with.
Yeah. I didn't have anything to say. Sorry.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Are we content with what's on the screen?
Max Q
What's on the
links
screen
and
is what came
default.
in, just renames plus its queue length instead of queue bytes, right?
Yeah. So we didn't change any modes. I left a note that says we talked a lot about it, so we anticipate more modes being added. And then, yeah, I should add the bullet that says we renamed buffer to queue.
Okay. And one last question from Stephen. You mentioned there is a approach with using blocking collection to have the drop behavior in, or there's not like any straightforward way. I missed that conversation when you were asked that question.
Well, what blocking collection are you using?
Let me check.
Are you using a bounded channel? Because if so, then we could just expose bounded channel full mode.
It's specifically blocking collection, like from the
System collection concurrent.
I looked for blocking queue.
Here.
So it just has triad returned false. What do we do? So right now when you're blocking, when triad returns false, are you just staying in a loop? Like, how are you blocking? Or not?
The blocking, I think the way the blocking happens is like when it's instantiated using the max Q messages, that like the amount. Without that, then it's unbound. Then since it's instantiated with that value, then it stops at that queue length until it's reduced and continues. It gets blocked on the thread.
Maybe this is add blocks and try add doesn't?
Yeah,
Add
try
blocks.
add wasn't.
right. We call add today.
Okay, so the behavior that you'll have is if console logger queue full mode is drop newest, then you'll call triad instead of add.
Okay.
I'm guessing.
I think so. Okay,
Or we change it over to use channels and use a bounded channel.
But yeah, if you expect the things like where Levi pointed out that you're maybe going to end up with complicated blocking rules of, okay, maybe errors should always block, but then at that point you couldn't reuse the enum from channels because it doesn't have a notion of an error. Mine was really, can we get rid of the enum entirely and just use another one? But if we think that we'll have deviation of behavior in terms of policies and modes and whatnot, then having a custom enum seems fine. So.
Thank you.
All right. Any other feedback on this one?
And seems like the metrics doesn't need to go through API review then. Oh, David is in the call.
Do we normally talk about perf counter label names in API review? Doesn't feel like we do. I don't feel like my eyes bleed all that much.
So, thank you. It just got approved, right?
Yeah, I marked it as
Done.
approved.
Oh, perfect.
as with all the we changed all the buffer stuff to queue stuff. But.
Yeah, no, it's great because David, as soon as you join the chat, like the API is approved, it's great. You should join this more often.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Just by virtue of being in your presence, we approve it.
That's all.
You are the approver.
The
Like, we
one
don't wanna
scenario
give you a
question
chance
that
to get
came
a
up.
word in edgewise.
The scenario question that came up, Fowler, is that like if you have multiple syncs and one of them being the console logger, why are you logging to the console?
So
Like
the
say you're
scenario
using
that-
serial log and
Right.
console logging.
Right. So the scenario the Bing team had was when you're using Kubernetes, they want to be able to quickly go to the console to see the logs quickly, but then they don't want that to slow down the actual performance. So they have the console there for like quick logs. He called it dev, but it's not dev. It's more like if an engineer runs kube control logs, they can see in the console. They can see kind of like a quick thing before they go to Geneva. Because I was like, why would you ever drop logs? That makes no sense. But it's because they have a full copy in a different sync that they were okay having the fast check on the command line or in the dashboard, just be a quick check for console to scroll through, and then it can check the full logs in Geneva. So that was the main scenario.
So, but basically, it seems like their scenario mostly there is look at the timestamp of the most recent message and see if it's doing
Yes.
anything. So
Yeah, which is why like it's funny, drop newest versus drop oldest. I don't know which one's better for that scenario. Like, maybe you want to drop oldest, not drop newest, but
Yeah, we had that discussion at length about like if your scenario is that you just want to know that the application's alive, then the newest data is the one that you care about, not the oldest data. If the
Right.
scenario is that you want to know if your application is running correctly, then the significance of the error should take precedence over absolutely everything else.
yeah.
but then that's complicated. I know it's a weird forum for it, but since you're here, David, and you've spent time in that region of the world, do you call it the Caribbean or the Caribbean?
Oh, so if you say the Caribbean, then we know you're not from the Caribbean.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. Assuming no one else has anything left on
Perfect, we're done.
the console logging horse, and we're otherwise out of distractions, I declare that we
So
are.
I've been.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I didn't realize you were adjourning.
Yeah, we're past time.
Give Stefan the last word. It's great.
Okay. I'm going to bang
Oh,
the gavel and say it's lunchtime, and
I don't want to delay anyone's lunch. It's fine. We can
so
talk offline.
thank you everybody, and see you again on Tuesday, where we'll still have more red items.
Yay! Bye bye.
Ciao.